Hello everyone, hope all is well, and thanks for tuning into Moose Motion. So today we're going to return to a slight normal now that Jack Skellington is basically all finished. And by normal I mean, well, working on some dinosaurs. During this video we'll be starting an Allosaurus. To be more precise, technically the Broken Jaw or Specimen USN 2315. Hello everyone, hope you're all doing well, and thank you for tuning into Moose Motion. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed the content, comment below what you think, share with your friends, and perhaps consider subscribing if you're new, and be sure you have your post notifications turned on so you don't miss any of the new content. Anyway, thank you for your support, it's highly appreciated. Anyway, let's dive into this Allosaurus. So you'll want to start out with some aluminum armature wire, and then approximately cut it to the same lengths. One could measure, but I'm a welder fabricator by trade, and I feel like I do enough of that at work, so generally in the sculpting studio, I like to do things a little bit more freehand. And then to strategically keep things lightweight, be sure to add a lot of aluminum foil to also save on clay as well. Now the big thing about doing theropods is they got that stature at the front that's really awkwardly front heavy, so you definitely want to keep that front as light as possible, especially if you're going to make this an actual stop motion doll, and that's the purpose behind this build. And then once you get your aluminum foil in place, you're going to want to add some hoops for future joint connections. So these will be where your legs are going, as well as the arms. And I like to use the cram it in the hole technique to make sure your armature wire slides in there, because it's a little frustrating with this armature doll flopping around all willy-nilly. So what I'm going to do is add a little bit of clay here to keep things, well, a little bit more stable before the baking process. This is generally kind of a pain in the butt because things are going to be moving around quite a lot, so you're going to want to make sure your proportions are nice and even, and there's generally a lot of off-camera work to make sure everything stays nice and scale. And yeah, one could measure, but again, I could be bothered less to do it here. And well, I haven't had any major problems with that since. Generally what I do is just kind of fold things over and, well, cut it to the same length, and that works well enough. And generally what I like to do for the actual joint connection part is just take that piece of armature wire and tie it around in a nice little tight hoop and around the other hoop. So a loop within a loop. And that generally creates actually a fairly decent shoulder joint or hip joint, to be quite honest. It's the same method I used for the Dinosaurs, and well, if you're new and haven't checked out that video, be sure to check out the links in the post description. Now, it's pretty much the same technique for both the hands as well as the feet here, so I'm going to jump into some fun facts about the Allosaurus itself. Allosaurus lived in the late Jurassic 150 million years ago, and its name means different lizard, and it's a member of the Allosauridae family. And the members of those family being large to mid-sized carnivore or theropod dinosaurs, Allosaurus himself being, well, a fairly mid-sized carnivore. Not exactly huge, but not exactly very small either. Definitely not something you would want to mess with. The largest known specimen of Allosaurus is 9.7 meters long, or 32 feet. Or some of them could get up to apparently 40 feet long. And those are probably different members of the Allosauridae family, I would assume. Now, before I get too carried away with Allosauridae, I will quickly give a voiceover on what just happened on screen there, essentially adding some extra oven-baked clay in between the layers of joints and stuff like that to make sure that there's, well, enough sturdiness, because once you start moving things around, you definitely don't want to deal with broken bones. And then once that part is out of the oven, it's time to add on to the extra skeleton bits. Now, one could basically do it one go instead of doing it in the oven several times. You probably run less risk of actually breaking things. However, I use Sculpey clay, and it never had that happen so far, and I've really badly burnt it, and it's never cracked then. So I feel fairly confident that you could probably rebake things quite a few times as long as it's at the appropriate temperature and you're not thinking about food while you're sculpting. And essentially the strategy behind actually throwing it in the oven ahead of time is to essentially avoid any unnecessary re-sculpting when you're starting to work with more fragile parts like these little delicate claws. Now, generally how I like to make my little claws is you start with a tiny little ball of clay and, well, then make several other different balls of clay, approximately the same size, depending on what types of claws you're doing. In this case, for the feet, they're all approximately the same size, so I just made all the balls of clay the same size. However, the hands were slightly different, so that one had to be done individually. And to give your claws that sharp and deadly iconic claw look, be sure to use the pinch and pull technique till you have a refined, well, claw. And once all the claws are made, before this thing goes in the oven one more time, I want to make sure that front end is nice and light and add one more layer of aluminum foil, because I just so happen to have some laying around from a bean burrito that I had for breakfast. And well, now that this bean-flavored Allosaurus is nice and light, we're ready to add one more layer of oven clay to make sure all of that stays. Now, the important thing about slapping this layer of oven clay on is to make sure that there's no air pockets, and that's a general rule of thumb you want to make sure you're doing for anything you're going to be sticking in the oven because, well, if there's air pockets, then air has a bad habit of expanding, and then you're going to have to spend many hours either resculpting or gluing things down and performing tiny surgery, and no one wants to do that. Anyway, now it's time to move on to the skull of the Allosaurus, probably one of the coolest parts about this thing. Now, oddly enough, the Allosaurus itself actually had a fairly weak bite force. It was only around 2100 newtons, which is really low if you take it into consideration that technically a leopard has 200 more newtons than a Allosaurus did. However, the skull was made for one interesting thing that the scientists definitely weren't expecting, and upon, well, studying the impact zones of the skull, they found out that the top half of the skull could handle up to 50,000 newtons. Anyway, more on that later because there's quite a few different scientific theories behind all that. Now I'm going to give you a quick once over on skull manufacturing. So to start out with your, well, skull, considering we're already on fine details, essentially you want to start with a blob and kind of shape that into a semi-skull shape, and then add refined details. What I like to do is generally add a bunch of different muscle attachment points so I can have a skull that is accurate as possible, and when it comes to adding muscle layers on, it looks a lot better in the long run. At least, that's what I'd like to tell myself, because most of this work isn't going to be seen. You probably don't necessarily need to make your skull as detailed as this, but I just kind of personally really enjoy it, so I'm going to do it anyway. And, well, if one wants to do that, you basically have to have a large amount of patience and use a large amount of, well, long, thin strips of clay or wormy dealies, and then strategically mush them into place, which is essentially the same technique used for the horns, which is very also close to the claws, which was the pinch and pull technique. Now, back in the oven. Now we're going to start working on the lower jaw and a little bit more on the actual specimen that we're building here. Now the specimen number USNM 2315, which was mentioned at the very beginning of the video, and some of you are probably a little confused as to why I mentioned that. Well, the reason I mentioned that is because this specimen is actually a very, very cool fossil find, and, well, it has a quite interesting story behind it. Now, the Allosaurus that I'm basing this sculpture off of, well, had a rather rough life to say the very least. Unfortunately, it had a shattered jaw and was really unrecognizable for quite a few years. It was found in 1883, so not exactly the best year for paleontology because, well, our knowledge was fairly limited still, as well as our technology, but with the help of modern technology, mainly CT scans, paleontologists and scientists were able to determine that this was a Allosaurus specimen, and, well, boy did it ever have a story to tell. Now, the story was really popularized by, well, the series Dinosaur Revolution, and if you haven't seen that, I highly recommend it. It was definitely a very good watch for me personally, and, well, is the inspiration behind this build, basically. Now, this character, or Allosaurus, is known as the Broken Jaw Allosaurus on the internet, and his episode that he was in the Dinosaur Revolution is known as the Watering Hole. So be sure to go check that out if you haven't seen it, and if you have, well, be sure to let me know in the comments below what you think, and perhaps we can have an open discussion on future animation projects for this character, because, yeah, he was tough, to say the very least. Not to mention, these teeth were very tough to put in. This took, well, over 2 hours to put those teeth in. And now we're going to move on to some glamour shots and a quick rundown and some interesting facts that I didn't have time for along the way. And seeing her on the subject of teeth, I will get that out of the way quick. This Allosaurus in particular probably had a few less teeth than the actual other known specimens, but on average, Allosaurus had about 70 teeth, around 4 inches. Now we're going to cover some of the jaw aspects where it had a rather gaping opening jaw, to say the very least. Now apparently this thing could open its jaw to about 79 degrees or even 92 degrees on some estimates. Now this comes into play when I was mentioning earlier about some of the hunting techniques that this thing had due to the skull having that extremely high number of newtons for the top half of it in comparison to the bottom. Now it's thought that the Allosaurus basically used its head like a hatchet to hunt, which is a pretty terrifying technique if you really think about it, and if it was, well, true, it definitely wouldn't be a very pleasant way to go. However, there is no exact fossil evidence to prove this fact, but it's pretty cool to think about. Now, I do have a lot more interesting facts I definitely would like to share with you all later on, but that's going to have to save for part 2 of the build, which will be the final episode in this build series for this little Allosaurus, where we'll be adding, well, the plasticine and all fine details. So during this video, we basically made the actual armature wire frame, which is basically the most vital part for most stop-motion dolls. Now, I do apologize for being a bit behind schedule on this video. Unfortunately, that's kind of a recurring theme of this channel. Now, in order to avoid that from happening again, I'm going to get right back into it. So during part 1 of this dinosaur project, we first made the armature doll skeleton, and if you haven't seen that, be sure to go check that out, so that way you're not too, well, out of date when it comes to the Allosaurus project here. Now, during that video was more of a clay tutorial because I figured that would be a little bit more important considering we're making, well, the base frame or the skeleton of the armature doll, which happens to be probably one of the more important parts, obviously, of the build. So during this video, we'll be diving into some more fun facts and, well, a lot more about the Allosaurus itself, as well as the genus Allosauridae. So without further ado, let's dive into some fun facts about the Allosaurus. Allosaurus is part of the Allosauridae family, and for lack of a better description, they're kind of a generic looking theropod dinosaur. So basically they have 3 toes and they have 3 fingers on their hands instead of the 2 like a Tyrannosaurus rex. And well, another thing, their size comparison definitely is nowhere near Tyrannosaurus rex. However, there is some members of the Allosauridae family that did get that big. We'll cover those stats later. There will be some relapse during this video, but not too much, just enough to kind of cover what we need to know basically. For example, the timeline here, we're obviously going to quickly cover that topic again. Allosaurus lived in the late Jurassic between 155 to 145 million years ago. Other dinosaurs Allosaurus lived in that time period with would have been sauropods such as the Brachiosaurus, Apatosaurus, and Camarasaurus, and other herbivores it lived alongside with include Dryosaurus, Nanosaurus, Camptosaurus, and Stegosaurus. Allosaurus preyed on a lot of these herbivorous dinosaurs, Stegosaurus in particular, as well as a lot of large sauropods. And there's lots of fossil evidence with, well, varying tooth marks from Allosaurus, as well as some of his Allosauridae family members. For example, Kagarodontosaurus, hopefully I'm saying that right, and Giganotosaurus, which is made popular by, well, the new Jurassic Park World Dominion movie. And, well, those are 2 famous, obviously, dinosaurs known for being quite large, and in particular, Giganotosaurus is quite a bit bigger than Tyrannosaurus rex. However, the bite force and various other stats weren't quite as impressive, but that's a completely different topic for next time, or a different video. Maybe a Giganotosaurus would be in the future. That'd be a pretty cool project. Hint, hint, wink, wink. Anyway, those 2 large theropod dinosaurs were assumed to be, well, fairly active predators, in particular preying upon a lot of the large sauropods during that time frame. And there's also lots of fossil evidence of sauropods having varying different tooth marks from Allosaurus himself, so it's thought that Allosaurus could have been also one of these, well, contributors to eating large sauropods, which it had a few different hunting techniques, which we'll go over right now, and that could be slightly controversial, and I have my own theory kind of on that one, so we'll dive into that topic right away. Now, Allosaurus had quite the arsenal inside its mouth. It was armed with 70 razor-sharp teeth designed through ripping and cutting through flesh, not compared to Tyrannosaurus rex, who basically had like a railway spike designed to pulverize just about anything it went through. And on a quick side note, Kagarodontosaurus, the name that I'm not too sure I'm properly pronouncing, its name, at any rate, means shark-toothed lizard or sharp-toothed lizard based on its teeth, and Allosaurus had very similar teeth structure in comparison to that large theropod as well. And seeing how I'm on the topic of defining names, or big messy Latin dinosaur names in particular, Allosaurus means different lizard. Now we'll cover more about the actual hunting topics and the possible controversy that I could be causing here. Unfortunately, there's some, well, doll drama here that I'm not too proud to admit. Unfortunately, there's some repairs that I had to do here, and, well, the thumbs and the fingers in particular were a big problem. And now that I've officially broke one of the claws, which happens to probably be one of the more vital pieces of the Allosaurus' hunting techniques, which some of those things happen to be quite large apparently. On average, they're about 7 inches, although the world record, I believe, is almost a foot, 11.5 inches long. That is quite the arsenal of hand weapons. Like, oh my god, that's a big claw. And on an interesting side note too, the closest finger to the inside of the Allosaurus is also very close to an opposable thumb. Now we're going to go back to the topic of its, well, arsenal in its mouth. With 70 razor-sharp teeth, there's a few different hunting techniques that it could have possibly used with that, given that its jaw hinge essentially could open up to 79 or even 92 degrees. That is ridiculous. That's borderline almost like a snake if you really think about it, but obviously couldn't dislocate things quite like that animal. Now, I do believe I kind of covered the first scientific theory about how Allosaurus would have hunted using this essentially gaping open jaw with that ridiculous angle. It could have possibly used it like a hatchet. I will just kind of do a brief overstatement, but basically the idea is that it could have used it like a hatchet because the forces on its head basically had really uneven amount of newtons to a certain degree. Basically, the top of its skull could handle 50,000 newtons, whereas the rest of it obviously could not handle that. And to put that in perspective, 50,000 newtons is pretty close to what Tyrannosaurus Rex's entire bite force was. That being said, obviously Allosaurus did not have anywhere close to that bite force. It only had about 2,100 newtons of force at the max end of things. Now, to put that in perspective, a modern-day leopard has 200 more newtons. Now, I'm not totally against the whole hatchet head theory, because it would be pretty cool. However, I just don't really think it's necessarily as applicable to a lot of these large sauropods as some people would be predicting, in my opinion. Now, I will admit, I'm by no means a paleontologist. I'm just a avid dinosaur nerd, but there's some things that I learned kind of going over the Allosaurus itself that I kind of found a little bit controversial, so I decided to, perhaps throwing my own theory out there is not such a bad thing, and what I think is probably the most likely scenario for how this thing was using its head, more or less. Now, given the high uneven amount of Newton force distribution on its skull, essentially, my opinion is that it probably would have used its skull kind of like a hatchet, perhaps on some of the smaller prey that it would have been hunting, more or less just kind of going for the neck or the throat, just delivering one massive crushing blow, essentially just paralyzing the thing on one strike and just not really having to spend a whole lot of energy on something that's really not going to, well, provide you with that much sustenance in the long run. And there is one other hatchet head theory for more or less how it could have been using this a means of hunting against sauropods in particular. It's thought that it could have been essentially a meat harvester, so it basically would have been ripping off large chunks of flesh off these sauropods and then just kind of running away eating that chunk. Now, I personally don't think that that would have been very liable, because if you look at the angles that these things would have been smashing its face into, these giant, 100-ton sauropods, it probably would have been breaking a lot of things. And, if you're using this as your most important tool to eat and hunt, it's probably not a good idea to be smashing it into these giant sauropods, in my personal opinion. Now, some of you might be at this point of the video saying, hey, later on you mentioned there was fossil evidence of Allosaurus itself feeding on sauropods, so what's with that stat? So, it is commonly known that, yes, Allosaurus was eating these large sauropods. However, there's a different technique that's also mentioned about hunting for these things, but is nowhere near as popular as far as I can understand, unfortunately. But in my opinion, it honestly makes a little bit more sense. Now, some people might not like this idea. I'm on the side of Allosaurus perhaps being a little bit more of a scavenger as opposed to an active hunter. Now, it probably was both more or less an opportunistic hunter, obviously, but given that there are these large sauropods with not a whole lot of things eating them, and obviously they're going to get, old or die of disease or various other things that happen in nature, and it's going to need something to eat them. So my opinion is that Allosaurus was a bit more of a scavenger, more or less, eating a lot of these big giant dead carcasses just laying around. Now, the reason I'm more or less on the side of this theory is because a lot of Allosauruses apparently have been found with essentially a lot of high stress fractures in their foot. So it's assumed that the Allosaurus would have been basically stepping on this carcass and then biting down on it and pulling up with its head, pushing on it with its foot, causing these, small fractures or stress fractures in its foot, essentially. So that would account for, the high number of newtons on the top of its skull, kind of doing this hook and pull technique, with the foot, which obviously also has the fossil evidence of these stress marks or stress cracks, essentially. So that's the reason I'm more or less on that side of things in comparison to it being a hatchet head hunter. Now, that all being said, I'm not entirely sure what the fossil evidence of these sauropod look like, more or less what the damage on the bones is, whether or not some of these wounds were known to actually heal over time in comparison to, say, something being, well, obviously post-mortem. So that's one thing I should probably mention, that I'm not entirely sure what that fossil evidence entirely entitles. But I kind of just figured that, you know, this is a well-known hunting technique that is discussed among paleontologists, and that's what I'm going to kind of more or less pick my side of things on, is that it probably would have been using this hook and pull while pushing on its foot, more or less. On an interesting side note, I even went as far as looking up how vultures essentially eat carcasses, because it's obviously widely known that vultures are primarily surviving off a lot of dead things and are scavenging a lot of the time, and I kind of, you know, was figuring, hey, I kind of remember them using their similar technique that is assumed that the Allosaurus did, where essentially they're putting their foot down on this carcass and then just kind of going to town and ripping it to absolute shreds. So yeah, that's the reason I'm kind of on that theory, because it's kind of seen in modern birds, which is also widely known that technically birds are also dinosaurs now. That being said, unfortunately, our feathered friends are nowhere probably near as terrifying or as cool as the dinosaurs, but it's also widely known that a lot of these dinosaurs actually had feathers now, and one thing I kind of was curious about and did quite a lot of homework on and couldn't find any really a whole lot of information on, unfortunately, was the fact that Allosaurus did it or did it not have feathers, and as far as I can tell, the answer is no, although it is assumed that Allosaurus could have possibly had small proto-feathers similar to what T-Rex is assumed to have had, because, well, for those of you who are unaware, Tyrannosaurus Rex technically does not have feathers either, which I've covered in other videos, and it's, well, because we found decent skin impressions of Tyrannosaurus Rex, which had no feathers whatsoever. Now, back to the topic of, well, the dinosaur at hand, Allosaurus. Now, probably one of the coolest facts that I personally learned while doing research for this video was the, well, sun visor theory for the little spikes on top of its head, which I found very interesting. Now, there's a few different theories for these head spikes or crests on top of its head, one of which is basically that it could have been a display structure to attract mates, going, ooh, look at me, I have these big horn spikes on top of my head, isn't that cool looking? But the other theory that I personally found a lot cooler is that these crests could have been actually used as little sun visors, essentially blocking out the sun from getting in its eyes. I mean, if you look at the angle of where these little horns are positioned, it's basically right at the top of its head, where if the sun is beating directly down on you, it would be actually probably quite effective. So that's my personal favorite theory behind that one, and I found that quite interesting. So hopefully it's something that you find kind of cool too. Now that we're drawing this project to an actual close and doing some finishing touches up on the Allosaurus, I'll leave you with one more cool fact that'll kind of lead up to the next project / animation that I'm going to be working on. Now, Allosaurus would have been a pretty quick predator. It ran up to about 21 miles an hour. Now, to put that in perspective, that's about as fast as a car driving through a residential area. Which leads me to, well, the next animation project. I have a little skyline that I finished a while ago, and I've been looking for an excuse to break it in, so it seems like, well, this dinosaur and the Therizinosaurus could have a lot of fun chasing down a skyline drifting through my small town in the basement. So I'm going to be basically starting that project this weekend, where I'm going to be doing a quick storyboard essentially on it and kind of running through how I do my stop motion animations. And if you find that interesting, be sure to have, well, your post notifications turned on if you're a subscriber, and if you're new, be sure to, well, subscribe if you're new. Anyway, time for the glamour shots. Hello everyone, hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to leave a like if you did, and if you learned something new about the Allosaurus, and comment below what you think, share with your friends, and perhaps consider subscribing if you're new. Anyway, that's enough from me. Until next time, take it easy.